Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Seymour, and my talk is on echolalia and autistic joy in William Shakespeare's play King John, which is thought to have been written in the mid-1590s. Here is an overview of my talk. I'll be looking at echolalia, which means repeating words and phrases in this play, and echolalia can be an autistic style of speaking. I argue that the enjoyable echolalia in this play enables people, whether they are autistic or not, to experience autistic joy. On this slide, you can see that actress Rosie Sheehy in a medieval-style dark brown dress and ornate crown, paired with a more modern light brown blazer, playing the role of King John in the Royal Shakespeare Company's production 2 years ago. I'll be returning to this particular production as an example later in the talk. And this was a really fabulous production, and it really carefully mixed medieval and modern elements. Broadly, echolalia is a type of autistic speech pattern. So it's not only associated with autism, but it can be kind of associated with autism. It's a type of autistic speech pattern involving the repetition of words and chunks of phrases. Sometimes it's said that autistic people repeat words and phrases out of context, but I dispute this because the person setting the context is often not the autistic person themselves. And these repeated words and phrases may be perfectly well contextualized from the autistic person's point of view. The Oxford English Dictionary is rather dismissive of echolalia, describing it as, number one, a pathological term describing the meaningless repetition of words and phrases, and number two, a depreciatory term for a succession of sounds in poetry which subordinates sense to sound. I'm interested in some of my current research in moving between the pathological and the poetic. I believe that analysing the joy of prosody and poetic sound helps us to understand the appeal of echolalia and to challenge this idea that echolalia is meaningless. As an autistic person who engages in echolalia on a daily basis, I understand that echolalia can be many things, and often because of others' reactions to it, I do understand that it can be a source of frustration, danger, and distress. In this talk, I certainly don't claim to speak for all autistic people. The talk is a mix of my own impressions of echolalia and my work as a literary scholar of the Renaissance. I'm in the early stages of my research on King John, and I'm very keen to hear from other neurodiverse people who feel comfortable to share about what echolalia means to you and what your experience of it is. I'm not just interested in echolalia as autistic speech, but also in how it might interact with other neurodiverse speech patterns, for instance, stammering. I also think that echolalia can be autistic work. I've noted anecdotally that it can become more intense and prolonged during and after moments of emotional intensity. So for me, one example is when I have been teaching and got excited about my students' ideas, my echolalia might go on for several hours after the class. I don't mean that it's emotional labour in the strict definition developed by the sociologist Arlie Hochschild in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart. Hochschild defines emotional labour as, I quote, the labour required, that is by workers and people facing roles, to induce or express feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others, end quote. So sometimes these people draw on or suppress their actual deep feelings in order to perform emotional labour. But I do think that echolalia is more about extra time factored in after an event. The echolalia after a conversation or a period of emotional intensity can be part of the emotional work that autistic people carry on for longer than a non-autistic person who participated in the same event. Understanding that echolalia can be many things to many people, I will focus on one particular feature of echolalia, that of autistic joy. The experience of echolalia can bring autistic joy to the person engaging in it. Though Shakespeare does represent the insults and the annoyance of people commenting negatively on repeated phrases, in his play King John, he enables the joy of Echolalia to be felt by the audience, not just by the one person engaging in it. And this is because he positions Echolalia as having the potential for fun, disruption, irreverence, but also class analysis and political import. I may receive comments on this paper that what I'm about to show you in King John is not Echolalia, it's just people repeating words. However, I believe that calling it Echolalia is an important tactical move because it enables us to see how the theatre might be a space for specifically autistic joy and for people across neurotypes to experience that joy together. Such a move towards the specifically autistic is, I think, important as we are often confronted by people who behave as if our lovability and or academic and or social validity is conditional on us not being too autistic. We may be told this by parents, caregivers, people in friendships and intimate relationships, but also by colleagues and those reading our work. So that is why to me it is important to love characters who seem to be autistic, even or especially, as we will see, they have names like Philip the Bastard. So let's get into King John. This play is based on historical events. King John was a real late 12th and early 13th century king, the younger brother of Richard the Lionheart. Shakespeare's play begins when Richard the Lionheart has just died and John has just taken the throne. The play then tracks John's reign and its troubles, which includes starting and losing a war with France and getting excommunicated because he disrespects the Pope. The character in this play that I am most interested in is a character called Philip the Bastard, often just known in the text and performances as the Bastard. He's called the Bastard in the early modern sense of being born outside of wedlock. This character, whose first name is Philip, is very proud of being a bastard because his father was actually the previous king, Richard the Lionheart. And Philip's mother had tried to keep the fact that she had had the king's baby a secret from her husband and the rest of her family, but Philip finds out. Actually, in one of Shakespeare's source texts, he finds this out by hearing mysterious echoes in the landscape that tell him that the Lionheart was his father, which is very interesting for my arguments about echolalia and repetition and their importance to this character. So Philip prefers being the king's bastard child to being the legitimate child of the man that he thought was his father. And in this play, this is also associated with Philip's resemblance and his physical resemblance to other members of John's family, King John's family. Philip's mother can still choose to legally recognise Philip as her and her husband's child. And if she does so, Philip can inherit her husband's wealth. However, when he finds out that his father was actually the previous king, Philip chooses to renounce the inheritance he was due and to proudly claim the title of bastard. So though he's lost out on future financial security, he's proud to be recognised as an illegitimate member of the royal family. He cannot inherit the throne, but he becomes a loyal hanger-on at royal events. He fights for King John in the war, and he's also a character who brings comedy to the play with his wordplay. On this slide, you can see Michael Abu Bakr, who played the bastard in the RSC's 2009 production, wearing a rather fabulous blazer, decorated with the heraldic lion of Richard the Lionheart. And I'll come back to this blazer later. The bastard starts attending the political meetings in which King John is involved. And I'm going to home in on one key moment where his echolalic style of speech has an impact that might variously be read as disruptive and politically impactful, but also just as playful and apolitical, turning royal insults into an enjoyable, repeated melody. So here's the scene on this slide. And here various rival rulers, Queen Constance, who wants her son to become King of England instead of John, the King of France, and the ruler of Austria are all arguing. They eventually go to war. Constance, who is a ranting, melancholy character, insults Austria, saying that though he dresses up in lion's clothes like a brave person, in fact he should put on the skin of a calf, because he's timid and weak like a calf. Austria was depicted in the recent performance as a boxer wearing this giant lion skin coat over his smart suit. I might put a picture on this slide. Constance uses the phrase, hang a calf skin on those recreant limbs, and the bastard picks up this phrase and repeats it a lot. So Constance says to Austria, thou wear a lion's hide, doff it for shame, and hang a calf skin on those recreant limbs. Austria, oh, that a man should speak those words to me. Bastard, and hang a calf skin on those recreant limbs. Austria, thou darest not say so, villain, for thy life. Bastard, and hang a calf skin on those recreant limbs. King John, we like not this, thou dost forget thyself. So John tries to stop the bastard, but the bastard carries on. Austria turns to the King of France and says, King Philip, listen to the cardinal, bastard, and hang a calf skin on his recreant limbs. Austria, well, ruffian, I must pocket up these wrongs because, bastard, your breeches best may carry them. Later, Austria tries to urge the King of France to agree with him. Austria, do so, King Philip, hang no more in doubt. Bastard, hang nothing but a calf skin, most sweet lout. King Philip, I am perplexed and know not what to say. As you can see, towards the end of the scene, the bastard modifies the phrase, hang a calf skin on those recreant limbs, to create a rhyme, lout with doubt. Later, he starts to transmute the image further, imagining the calf skin as a material entity. When he wants Austria to shut up, the bastard imagines balling the calf skin up and putting it in Austria's mouth. He says, will not a calf skin stop that mouth of thine? The early texts are a little tricky because the bastard's first name is Philip and the King of France is also called Philip. So there can be confusion in some editions and sometimes in performance over whether the King of France is joining in the fun. Except when the Austria turns to the bastard and calls him a ruffian, it's hard to tell whether the other characters are ignoring the bastard's repeated phrase, or whether their increasing political anger and eventual declaration of war is partly because they're getting annoyed at the bastard and it whips them up to go to war. I think it matters whether they rhyme with him. If they rhyme their lines with his calfskin line, it suggests they're taking his words into account. When they don't rhyme with him, but they rhyme with each other, or they don't rhyme, it suggests that they're ignoring the bastard. As we saw, the bastard responds specifically to Austria when he modifies his repeated phrase to rhyme with Austria's. King Philip, hang no more in doubt, hang nothing but a calfskin, most sweet lout. In the scientific literature I've read on echolalia, there are debates about whether the autistic person is just borrowing others' words without understanding their internal structure. But I think that Shakespeare's bastard talks back to this. He's an example of how echolalia isn't just something that derives from others, that the autistic person then uncreatively picks up without these words being meaningful to them. It can be a way of engaging in conversation that the others don't always understand or may take offence at. Philip has ownership over his echolalia. He uses imagery of calves and skins earlier in the play, so his echolalia relates to his established imaginative and lexical world. He says to Austria earlier that he's going to smoke his skin coat, and when discussing his lineage, John and the bastard use an image of the bastard and his mother as a cow and a calf. I want to note too the bastard's literal interpretation of the phrase, pocket up your wrongs. To pocket up wrongs probably meant to endure wrongs. So Austria is telling the bastard that he will submit to his taunt. However, the bastard butts in on Austria by literalizing this idea and considering whether Austria's pockets in his trousers or breeches have space enough for the wrongs. Your breeches best may carry them. This fun with the literal meaning of words is very autistic humour to me, but I think it can also be funny if you're not autistic. I don't necessarily mean that Shakespeare was autistic, but rather that he wrote a joke that might speak especially to an autistic person, but also enable people across neurotypes to enjoy the joke. I'm going to focus in conclusion on two ways in which echolalia can be meaningful, the familial and the political. As I mentioned in Shakespeare's Source, the bastard repeats Latin words he hears supernaturally, saying that the king is his father, which is obviously deeply meaningful to him. Echolalia is also part of the wordplay that the bastard engages in when he takes on his new social status as the king's son. He says that now he's the king's son, he can use language in new ways. For instance, forgetting his fellow citizens' names because other people are now socially lower than him. I'm not interested in holding up particular researchers or articles, but some psychological research I've read sort of gestures towards the idea that echolalia may actually be meaningful to the autistic person. But I think that Shakespeare was already going beyond this, in depicting the political and classed valence of the bastard reanimating Queen Constance's voice. In his 1998 article on the character of the bastard, Edward Gieskes writes, "The bastard has just been made part of a class whose speech patterns he can describe with a measure of detachment and amusement. The bastard's evocation of the courtier's dialogue of compliment serves two purposes. First, it ridicules that dialogue by caricature, but second, and most importantly, his speech shows the bastard's awareness of and willingness to adopt the speech patterns he pokes fun at." Gieskes isn't here talking explicitly about the hang of calf skin phrase that I am focusing on. However, I think this article really opens out the possibilities to think of echolalia as class analysis. Gieskes argues that the bastard occupies, I quote, a liminal status in the social order, end quote. We might read his echolalia as mocking the upper classes by ripping off Constance's shrill insult, but also as relishing the power that he gets when he picks up on this insult the queen has used and repeats it to another powerful ruler. On his liminality, I just want to return to this blazer, which the bastard wore in the recent RSC production. The blazer has the heraldic insignia of the Plantagenet royal family, the lions passant gardant. But overall, the outfit is casual. It's a blazer and a turtleneck. And I think this smart casual attire really captures the bastard's liminality. Audience responses to the calfskin scene is often laughter. I'm not saying that the wars and skullduggery that the characters engage in King John is good, but the way that this character in the play can engage in wordplay that is identifiable within autistic frameworks and can do so in a way that people across neurotypes can feel joy and release at is, I think, amazing. When I later take this talk to a more mixed audience rather than one with a critical mass of other autistic people, I'm imagining at least one critic will say, "Why call this echolalia rather than simply repetition?" My answer is because why not? Because autistic joy and autistic laughter are important. Because an autistic person could enjoy this scene and claim it as their own. Because we still have not laid down adequate anchors in the past, so these anchors are waiting for us. There have always been people like us, so why not? Maybe people will tell me why not in the Q&A, but I hope you've enjoyed this talk and thank you very much for listening to it.